What is going on YouTube? Today we're going to review Chris Bumstead's back workout. We're just basically going to be breaking down the mechanics of the motions that he's doing, what he's targeting, and get into some of the specifics about maybe why he's doing what he's doing. A lot of times I find it's useful to explain some of the mechanistic things behind the way bodybuilders do things, or maybe why they prefer specific setups. It can be useful just applying across scenarios. So let's dive right into it. Exercise one is going to be this sort of pull down that, if many of you are familiar, which you probably are, is a Panada pull down that basically just looks like a hammer strength pull down, like the plate loaded hammer strength pull down. And my major comments with these kinds of machines are that they are very, very useful for, a sort of large bang for your buck exercise, right? Because of the fact that they do work in an arc, they work with the arm in the direction of force changes throughout the range of motion. So basically what that means is, as Chris sort of gets to the top of this motion, the load is pulling him more vertically or upward, right, when his arms are stretched over his head, which is going to be really, really good for like the lower lats and stuff like that. And then as he pulls down and starts to pull back behind his body, he'll start to target more, of the upper back, mainly, rear delts, rhomboids, traps, those kinds of things. So those kinds of like arcing motions, and I'll just go back here, toward this top portion of the range, the load is basically going in the direction of the arrow. So you can picture that sort of mimicking like a vertical type pull down. But then as he gets to the bottom, you can see that the load actually wants to go forward, right? So it's a more complete exercise from the standpoint of loading more of the total range of that flexion extension pattern. And obviously, depending on the width of, the arm path, the muscle recruitment will change. So if he's a little bit wider, it'll be a little bit more upper back, rear delt predominantly. And then if he's a little bit narrower, it'll be more lat, dominant. But he'll basically get everything in his back to some degree with this exercise. So, if you're shorter on time, you're looking for an option that is like high level bang for your buck. You can do this in the way that Chris is, especially just because like toward the bottom, you see he's also actually moving his torso a little bit backwards, so he can pull into that more retracted position. If you want to use this piece for just one portion of the arc or another, right? So maybe you just want to kind of get the top half for more of that lengthened lower lat versus, the bottom half more for like a row type motion, that's perfectly fine. You just have to kind of be aware of like what you're actually trying to do with the exercise, which to me is never really a bad thing, actually understanding what you're doing, understanding what you're biasing, because ultimately there will always be a muscular bias with any exercise that you do, and not knowing the bias is not really helpful to anyone. So looks like they're going to move on to like a horizontal type row, which is also a slight arcing type motion, which again, in this case, because it's not obviously going overhead, is still going to be a little bit more specific to the path of motion of the arm. But as you'll see, like a lot of guys that I see use this, especially a lot of bigger guys, tend to want to use a lot of elbow flexor, right? A lot of elbow bending motion, unless they're very intentional about keeping their arm tight to their body. So for this specific arc of motion, I wouldn't try to really pull out if you're in line with the machine. You would want to pull basically inside of a path where that arc of motion would stay in line with the arm, right? So if the direction of the arc is this way, facing toward the camera, you want to pull in line with that arc, much like in a preacher curl or a tricep extension machine or something like that. You wouldn't want to pull outward on a machine that is moving in this path, right? But a machine that can sort of diverge and move into outward, well, that makes now sense to actually, pull more outward. But if you pull outward basically on a machine that wants to go this way, you're just going to end up like doing a curl instead. So this I would call a more lat specific motion, because you do have to stay tighter to the body. So that's maybe just a general rule of thumb that is potentially helpful to you all, which is that like the more divergent or in to out a machine row or pull down is, the more upper back, rear delt, potentially Terry's type motion that's going to be, like Terry's major. But the more sort of machines that are more like linear in line or diverging to a much smaller degree, those are going to be much more lat focused. So again, this kind of arcing machine is going to be lat focused because of the reasons we just mentioned, and it'll recruit more proportionally the upper lats, in addition obviously to the rear delts and the traps and the rhomboids, which are helping out toward really the top end of the motion here. Obviously this can change depending on intent, because this machine does look like it actually gets heaviest toward the top, meaning the weight is farthest away from where it's pivoting. This potentially would be an exercise that I would want to see flipped from a resistance profile, meaning that I would want to see it heavier at the bottom and lighter at the top. So some machines get that a little bit backwards, but you can just use a little bit of intent with machines that are not set up perfectly from a resistance profile standpoint, meaning that if they do feel like really easy at the bottom, like in that initial portion of the range, and then super, super difficult at the top, what you can do is actually use an intent to utilize momentum to your advantage, right? Where you can actually pull a little bit harder in the initial portion of the range so that the bottom proportionately becomes harder and the top proportionally becomes lighter. So that's a little bit more of an advanced technique. If that didn't really make too much sense, I wouldn't worry about it. But a lot of guys do that accidentally, where like when they're rowing with cables, they pull really, really hard in the initial phase, and then it gets lighter because the momentum can kind of carry them back into the range, as opposed to trying to be really, really slow and controlled with the cables, where that basically makes it so that, you know, you're in a situation where like it's impossible in the short position and really, really easy in the lengthed position. But here's another view which may be helpful to visualize. Like, here's what I mean by the weight actually moving and getting heavier, right? So this is the axis, and you can sort of just visualize it as this distance, right? Effective distance. The weight's going to move slightly farther away, so it's not like a huge increase in load, but because of how much weaker you're getting actually in the upper back and the strength of the upper back toward the short position, it'll be disproportionately hard. So if you do feel that, and again, Chris is kind of doing it because he's probably very naturally sort of good at feeling machines out and just making it better for his body and what he's trying to do. You know, a little bit of intent sort of out of the bottom, you see him yanking it a little bit, can actually, again, be very helpful. And based on the way he's doing it here, it actually looks like it's a little bit more, you know, upper back focus, just because the path is a little bit wider. But again, if the path is wider, he has to shift over to the other side because, again, he wants that arm path to be in line with where the machine is moving. Looks like some T-bar rows next. Obviously, there will be some, you know, a good amount of erector recruitment, glute recruitment, quad recruitment to stabilize the lower body. But this will mostly be a sort of upper back exercise given the width of his arm path. And unlike the machine that we just looked at, this machine actually drops off in load where it actually gets lighter toward the top. Something to note also with like fixed implements, meaning like machines like this that Chris is currently using that have basically, if I can skip forward here, so this fixed handle, right? Fixed handles will always provide a constraint for the arms, meaning that there's obviously a limitation in where you can pull. So unlike a cable where you, as I mentioned, you can pull out or down, you know, you have to pull in the path of motion that the machine is moving, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It also just generally means that your arm path will be constrained, number one, and then number two, you typically will involve more elbow flexor or elbow bend if you want to get more range in that lengthened position, because again, if you want to get more range and stretch on the tissues of the back, your hands have to be a little bit more narrow and closer together. The wider that you move, even though like in this portion of the range, you may be more sort of shoulder dominant than you would be in this portion of the range if the load is a little bit closer to you, or like farther from the elbow rather. You may put yourself in a position where you're losing range if you go too wide. So basically what I would say is like, choose a width that's comfortable for you, but try to err on the side of a little bit more narrow if I had to say, just because getting load in that stretch position appears to be very important, especially just in application with what you see with a lot of high-level guys. You see a lot of high-level guys, you know, really getting stretches across their body, above their head, etc. So moving on to the lat pullover machine, which is not really predominantly a lat exercise, as much as it is like a sort of upper back, rear delt, teres based motion. Like a lot of people feel this fatigue very locally, at least toward the top of the range, in that sort of like more armpit type area, as opposed to like the actual belly of the lower lats. And this is an arcing motion, much like the other motion that we just went over. Obviously, the point of contact is different because, you know, the elbows are on the pads, but sort of just picture how the direction of force is going to change here, right? So if this guy can move out of the way, at the top of the motion, right, it's pulling his arm backward, right? So at the top of the motion, the pad is pushing this way. So he has to push, basically has to push forward at this point. What's really going to move the load forward in this position is, as I mentioned, like teres rear delt. Obviously, it goes without saying that that's more just like from a leverage-based standpoint. It's not necessarily from like a what is going to be recruited and what is the outcome going to be standpoint. So obviously you will get some degree of lat, but because the arms are so far overhead, something like the costal pec or the lower pec is actually going to be in a really good position to co-contract and contribute along with the rear delt and the teres in the top portion of the motion. So if you're looking to create a motion that is going to load a stretched lat and give it mechanical advantage overhead, you're going to want to choose something like the first exercise that Chris did, or that arcing pull down, as opposed to this motion, because this motion is going to give advantage to other tissues, again, just because of that direction of force and the intent of where he actually has to move his arm. So again, lower pec, rear delt, teres are going to be recruited most in the top. And then as he starts to get maybe to the middle of the range, imagine the force direction is now pushing his arms up, so that's going to be much more lat specific. And then as he comes to the bottom, he's basically like resisting a direction of force that would be similar to just like a regular cable row where the force is forward. So much more lat in the bottom portions of the range because of how the force direction changes, but in the top portion of the range, you know, you would want to, or you would likely feel more lower pec, more rear delt, and more teres. If that makes sense. So again, not like an exercise that's not a lat exercise. I would 100% say it's a lat exercise. It's just not as lat dominant as that initial pull down that he did would be. Again, just from like a mechanical advantage standpoint, where you would you know, want that lat to be more loaded in like a pull down type motion, so you can keep the arm sort of tight to the body, and so that you can put the load in a direction that the lat is going to be really good at resisting, as opposed to that top position again, where his arm is basically just going to want to be pulled behind his body as opposed to sort of up and across his body, again, as in that first type pull down. So last, maybe not last, but I'm pretty sure, pretty close to last. Maybe he's going to do some other stuff. Biceps. Yeah. We got basically what people call a lat prayer, which, you know, from a mechanical standpoint is going to be a little bit more lat specific, again, because of the loading direction, but not as specific, again, as that pull down type motion. So again, the motion here is very, very similar, but the rotation of the arms is probably a little bit different. So because the arms are a little bit more folded in, this actually may be a little bit more lower pec, but a lot of people, a lot of bodybuilders tend to have a high degree of intent with this motion and squeezing their lats, which basically just means that they're like doing a pose as they're doing the exercise, which I don't think is a particularly good thing to do. I think you should basically just use exercises that are guided by good mechanics and proper loading directions, rather than like your the amount of mental focus and attention to squeezing that you can put into the exercise. So just maybe an important note for all of you that are using exercises is, like, if you really have to work super hard to actually feel recruitment in a tissue, it's probably not a particularly good exercise to do for that muscle group. So moving on to biceps. Face away curl, love this variation, and as you can see, we have a really good degree of load drop off toward the top of the range. So what that basically means is, see how the cable, I wouldn't put it this significantly, but the cable is basically moving much closer to his forearm at the top, which just means that the loading is going to be heaviest toward the bottom, which from a mechanical standpoint is going to be where you're strongest. So though I wouldn't get to a point, like if I were Chris, I would take like half a step back so the cable doesn't just run into the forearm, and so that there's actually a little bit more load toward the top. But it's a fantastic exercise to train that stretch position of the biceps, and I believe he's using a functional trainer here to do that. If you don't have access to a functional trainer, you can definitely just use a single cable. You don't have to do it two arms at the same time, and I would also argue that in many cases, like for bigger guys and bigger girls, it'll be a little bit more comfortable to do single arm anyway. So skipping forward here, saying just another set again, loaded heavier toward the bottom. We're doing some flexing, great, some talking. I'm trying to skip over a lot of the talking now when I do these video reviews, just because not only is it just extra sound that I you know have to edit, but it's also a lot of times it's just like fuckery and banter, which is fine. So it looks like the last exercise is going to be hammer curl. Yeah, last exercise is hammer curl, which, as many of you probably already know, obviously a good amount of biceps in here, but there will be a little bit of a shift in bias because of the neutral or semi-pronated grip toward the brachialis and the brachioradialis, which are just the other elbow flexors, right? The brachioradialis is going to run sort of on top of the forearm, and then the brachialis is going to run underneath of the biceps on the upper arm. I tend to want to do these with cable as well. Like I think that if Chris were to do these just with the same exact machine, it would probably be a little bit more comfortable just from like a long-term loading standpoint, just because you do get a little bit of load on elbow rotation when you're just standing and doing it normally. Or you could just hinge over a little bit, let your arms hang, you know, a little bit more. But you know, longer term, who knows if this is going to be something that's problematic. Typically, what I look to see, or basically what I look for when I'm looking at like you know, how are we most able to efficiently load the elbow is how much is the shoulder like moving in response to the elbow motion, right? So you can see that like the shoulder here, and what I would look for is just kind of the bulk of the arm. Easier to see here. See how the elbow kind of like moves out and almost looks like it like moves up and out at the same time? That's basically just his shoulder trying to prevent his elbow from being loaded in sort of like a rotational direction. And he's probably also just like moving his arm out of the way of his body to some degree in addition, right? So people who are probably smaller can get away with curling across and being loaded in a direction that's just basically in line with where the elbow is moving. But the bigger you get, the more your arms puff out, right? The more help you're gonna actually need from the shoulder to actually sort of account for that extra rotational force on the elbow. So if you're doing these, do them with a cable or just hinge over and let your arms hang, you know, doing it single arm, something like that, or even double arm, just letting your arms hang. It'll probably be much more comfortable, especially if you're a bigger human being, like I said. So hopefully that was helpful just to kind of review some of the exercises. I've done one of these before, I think, with a pull day, but these exercises were obviously different because he's at a different gym. Hopefully that was helpful. Those insights were maybe useful in some way. And if you want to see me review a specific video, you can link it in the comments, or just, you know, someone else who puts out fitness content who, you know, maybe you're curious about in terms of my review of their content. Let me know in the comments, and I'll try to, you know, get that kind of stuff done as well. So thanks for watching, and see you all in the next one.